Okay, friends, welcome to the lecture on Rousseau. Friends, this morning lecture is a reading of J.S. McClleand's writing on social contract theories. So, in his book, the history of political thought, J.S. McClleand discuss the theory of social contract in length. And our reading is Social Contract Third from his book, as I told you, The History of Political Thought. McClelland says, Rousseau's life was like a book. For example, his books, Confessions and Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, are apologies, are written in form of apologies for a life he lived wrong. Some readers of Confessions as well Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, would feel that these books are embarrassingly frank, that he was very open in the writings. And other writers would feel that it's an honest introspection which talks about a pre-Freudian innocence. A pre-Freudian innocence in Rousseau. It means pre-Freudian innocence means that Rousseau was writing like you are born, that he was born, he was born naive before you develop any subject consciousness in you. That before you develop any subject consciousness, you are not going to judge anything. Like before you make any sense of language or name or identifying objects around you, that is called pre-Freudic innocence. And Rousseau, in his book Confessions, was writing with a pre-Freudic innocence, that he was very frank and he was openly saying whatever things he had done. And this is one of the or frankest books ever written by a writer. So he talks the innermost secrets of his life through Confessions. That's why it is said that it was written with a pre-Freudic innocence. So, friends, Rousseau always aroused certain passion in other people. Is able to provoke passion in other people because he was such a very influential person. He influenced so many people so passionately, so intensely. But friends, one problem with Rousseau was that he was able to inspire other people at some instance, and other occasions he made them his enemies. That was a little bit contradictory. So one day Rousseau's friends become enemies, other day enemies become friends. That was the kind of Rousseauian personality. That is, Rousseau was capable of dividing people. into sides for and against him. He was able to create people against him, also by his side. So one day you can find somebody liking Rousseau intensely, and on other day you will see that people disliking Rousseau very intensely. This was the kind of contradictory personality of Rousseau. It's a little bit very complicated personality. And friends, you see that there is what may be called a Rousseau problem that which McClleand talks about. What is the Rousseau problem? And let us go through the Rousseau problem by reading J.S. McClleand in today's lecture. What is this Rousseau problem? When you read Socrates, you will see that there is a Socratic problem. Just like that, when you read Rousseau, there is what may be called a Rousseau problem. All commentaries on Rousseau agree that Rousseau was a different personality, not like the philosophers we had seen so far. Friends, you have seen Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, Aquinas, Hobbes, before that Machiavelli, John Locke. See, Rousseau possesses certain complicated and very contradictory personal side when we compare Rousseau with all other aforesaid philosophers. That's why it is said that, or McClleand says that Rousseau was a different personality. The problem, is that, Rousseau was the first political philosopher in the world. He was the first political philosopher in the world. Before that, up to John Locke, they have no such distinction. But Rousseau was the first political philosopher in the world to be blamed for a great political event, the French Revolution. Before that, Locke was called the intellectual godfather of American Revolution. That said, he was not directly connected with the American, revolution or Declaration of American Independence, but he had an indirect intellectual influence that his conception of the rights of man, in a sense, influenced the idea of citizenship and the idea of man's rights and man's happiness when the American Declaration was passed. But here you will see that Rousseau is single-handedly was made alleged responsible for French Revolution. Some of Rousseau's critics argued that Rousseau caused French Revolution. That's quite surprising that a person single-handedly became reason for a great revolution in the world. That is something unbecoming in modern day. That's why, friends, it's very difficult to approach Rousseau compared to other writers we have seen before, or let alone social contractualist theorists like Thomas Hobbes or John Locke. Compared to all other political philosophers we have seen this far, Rousseau is, of course, very difficult. But Leo-Strauss tell that all the writers, classical writers, from Plato onwards to the modern, we have discussed the fact that Leo-Strauss was claiming there are esoteric elements in the writings of all the writers, philosophers we have in the classic tradition. That is, they write for a select number of people, and only those people can understand what these writers had actually meant in their vocabulary systems or linguistic system. But despite that fact, people like Leo Strauss claims that there are esoteric traditions in all the, including Machiavelli. Machiavelli was said to be one of the most practical writers of all the time, though he plainly writes. But even Machiavelli is considered having esoteric tradition according to Leo Strauss. But friends, let alone this esoteric tradition, which Leo Strauss claims, we can see that Rousseau is very difficult to approach because he is contradictory. His philosophy is contradictory. That's why McClleand, in his reading, Social Contract Third, will give you certain tips for understanding Machiavelli in a very distinct way. See, when we read other philosophers in McClleand's book, History of Political Thought, we will not get this kinds of a tip when we are about to study other philosophers. And only for Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, McClleand is giving you certain tips because Rousseau is such very complicated and also contradictory political philosopher. And McClleand tell you that in this reading, the best way in approaching Rousseau is through reading the writings of his critics. Look, the method he adopted. He was advising us that if you want to understand Rousseau in proper light, friends, you approach Rousseau not plainly through his writings alone. First, you read the critics of Rousseau, then you start understanding Rousseau's own philosophy. So, friends, that's why in this reading, we, instead of going to Rousseau's political philosophy first, we are going the opposite direction. That is, we are learning the criticism on Rousseau, then we can move on to the political philosophy of Rousseau. Right. So, friends, there are four very important and major criticism against Rousseau, which J.S. McClleand identified in this book, The History of Political Thought, Social Contract Third. Let us first see what Edmund Burke had to say about Rousseau. And we had seen Edmund Burke before, I think in some of my previous lectures. I feel like I have talked to you about Edmund Burke. Did I tell you about Edmund Burke before, friends? No? No, I didn't tell you about Edmund Burke and his book Reflections on the Revolutions in France. Do you remember? Nobody remember, friends?
Illa, sir.
No, I didn't tell. I didn't tell you about Reflections on the Revolutions in France. Tom Paine, no? And Rights of Man, these kinds of books not introduced in your class. Or maybe in first BA, I forgot. No, are you sure, friends?
Sir,
Sure?
yes.
Okay. So friends, okay, leave it. Friends, Edmund Burke has written a book titled Reflections on the Revolution in France, and it was written in 1790. Burke assumed that French Revolution had been caused by books. Look, the argument he was trying to make, that French Revolution was simply caused by books and ideology. Two things caused a great revolution in human history. One of the greatest revolutions in human history, French Revolution. What caused it? According to Burke, it was caused by books and ideology. So, who caused it? None other than Rousseau. None other than Rousseau caused French Revolution. That is what Burke said. And Burke had a solution to French Revolution, that all damages which was caused by French Revolution, which was inspired by books, can be undone, can be resolved only through counter books. You have to write against French Revolution because people have written for French Revolution. So you have to undo what French Revolution had done to you by writing books that counter French Revolution. That's why Burke wrote the famous book Reflections on the Revolution in France, 1790, a 1790 book. Sorry. Burke singled out Rousseau as the chief, culprit for French Revolution. Burke is arguing, interestingly, that French Revolution was made in the name of ideology. Therefore, counter-revolutionary position, that your critic of French Revolution will become incomplete without an ideology. So not only books you have to write against French Revolution, you have to propose counter-ideology against French Revolution, which was famous for its ideology, rights of man. Liberty, fraternity, and equality. That men by nature had certain rights. And Burke argued that you can undo the damages caused by French Revolution and Rousseau only through proposing counter-ideology. So Burke argued the origin of French Revolution lies in the fact that there is revolutionary mandates in the writings or in the political thought of Rousseau. And Burke says the credo of Rousseau was rights of man and citizen. And Burke argued that the new modern man, that is what Rousseau was talking about, the new modern man. That is, Rousseau lived in the 18th century. And when we look at Rousseau back, see, medieval era, man was not that important, but faith in God was important. And in the ancient world, community was important. That is, polis was important, and no man was important. And Rousseau's writings liberated man from the hold of polis and from the hold of faith. And Rousseau liberated man from all the old world and created a new man. And Burke argued, this new man Rousseau created was based on certain principles, certain premises, philosophical premises. Rousseau calls this priori. Burke calls this priori. That Rousseau had a certain priori. What is priori? Priori is that which doesn't require any proof. If you say man has right, you need not to ask why do men need to have right. Of course, you have to ask. I have a right to criticize government. When somebody tell that, you have to make a counter question. Why do people enjoy right to criticize government? So they are beginning from a priori position that I have a right to criticize the government. Then you have to ask, why do you need to have such a right? So the problem here with Rousseau, according to Burke, is that Rousseau begins from certain priori. That is, Rousseau formed his thought from a small number of fixed principles. From a small number of fixed principles. And you are not supposed to ask proof for that fixed principle. For example, rights of man. Rousseau was saying that man got certain rights. When you say that, you are not supposed to question that. Why you are not supposed to question that? Because rights of man is a priori. You don't need any proof that man need to enjoy certain rights. Of course, we have to ask. As rational creatures, we have to ask, why do man need to possess certain rights? But Rousseau started from these kinds of certain few fixed principles upon which he built a political philosophy system. For example, as I told you, you saying men have a right, men have a right. In doing so, Burke argued that Rousseau's thought assumed that you need not to ask whether man need right, and right is an unquestionable category in Rousseau's thought. Right is an unquestionable category in Rousseau's thought. Burke says it's wrong to begin from priori. It's wrong to begin from priori. And Burke was so much critical of the Enlightenment movement. Because according to Burke, Rousseau was a product of Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment movement of the 17th century begins from priori. All their assumptions begins from priori. Man got right, man got certain liberty, man is free in the nature. These kinds of assumptions are priori. Because they are philosophical schemes, which doesn't, which is not based on sound proofs. And Enlightenment called these priori as principles of human nature. That man got certain rights, there are natural laws, there are liberty in the nature. Man need to have property, Locke says. So these kinds of arguments are priori. Hobbes says man in the state of nature was, inward looking, self-motivated, and he was possessing an important right called right to self-preservation. When Hobbes was saying that, he assumes all these, ideas from priori. There is no proof to say like that. When it comes to Locke, the thing is very same. Locke was arguing man possesses right to life, liberty, and property. And when he was arguing that, he doesn't produce the proof. They are all priori. Man possesses right to property, liberty, and life. And Burke argued, ordinary men do not bother to think about events and things from historical points of view. Friends, we are all ordinary people. We are not people, we are not endowed with the brainy skull of Rousseau or Locke or Plato. We are very ordinary people. Our neurons are very normal neurons. And for ordinary people like us, we need not to bother about, events and things from historical points of view. Our problem is that, we want to have money to live in this world. We need shelter. We need clothes. We need some kind of social recognition. We need cars. We need a mobile phone. These are things ordinary people are bothered about. And we need not to think about how things originated, why this, and whether, man enjoyed right. These are all philosophical questions we are not bothered about. Of course, none of us are bothered about these kinds of things. Our immediate issue is, how to live in this world. So, friends, men who have to learn quickly or wish to do things quickly do not have the time to begin to think historically. So we never think historically because we want to finish things very quick. We want to do things very quick. We want to learn things very quick. That's what Burke argued. This is what the ordinary behavior of ordinary man. For example, you are doing a postgraduate program, MA Governance and Politics. MA in Governance and Politics. What is your priority, friends? Your priority is to finish your course and get a certificate. Am I correct? And you never ask, what is the purpose of this certificate? Why should I get a postgraduate degree? What role do I expected to perform in the society with the certificate? None of us are bothered about these kinds of philosophical questions. None of us are bothered about to think about postgraduate degree in historical terms. Burke argued, you never think how this PG degree became what it is now. Do I learn any skill by this course or certificate? But friends, these kinds of questions are in the priorities of ordinary people like us. These are not our priority. What is our priority? Finish the course and get the certificate and find a job. So to think historically, like Burke, about events require a sophisticated education. And even to think about political events, you need to get a sophisticated political education. And friends, Burke argued, you should get this education. That is, this education you should gain from only those schools which is capable of giving you that education. That in society there are many schools which give you education, but Burke says they are not all schools which give you the right kind of education. For example, Burke, if you think in terms of what Burke said, Burke criticized Rousseau. For example, the education you get from Oxford University is different from the kind of education you will get from Kanu University. Oxford has very strong curriculum and very strong intellectual foundation. Its academics got very strong foundation. So students who gets graduated from Oxford, of course, is far better than those who graduate from Kanu University. Of course, there is no point of debate. It's like that. So here, from a Burke points of view, if Oxford developed a strong education and a strong educational culture, it is because Oxford has a very long history, habits, culture, tradition. It's a time-tested institution. That's why it produces better degrees. And friends, a university which is founded very recently, which gives you certificate, will not give you the quality that Oxford gives, because the foundation of Oxford is in history. But the foundation of the degree that you are going to receive from Kanu University is not based on that custom, tradition, and history. But ordinary people never bother about these kinds of things. What is our botheration? Our botheration is just to get a degree. We are not bothered about whether we get it from Oxford or somewhere else. Our botheration is to get a degree. And we never go behind philosophical questions associated with your degree. So Burke blames Rousseau for this kinds of generation of thought system. Who is responsible for making people think like this? It was Rousseau. Rousseau democratized all these kinds of culture, tradition, customs, habits. Rousseau democratized. Rousseau is the typical, thinker of the arch rational movement, rational enlightenment movement. He is typically an enlightenment man, typically a rationalist. For example, Rousseau would argue that it is not, for example, Rousseau would argue it is not where did you study, but what you study is important. Friends, from a Burkean points of view, when you compare Oxford with the Cornell University degree program, Rousseau would argue that it is not a matter of where did you study, rather what did you study is important and how did you study is important. And Burke criticized Rousseau for this argument. Rousseau encouraged his disciples, his followers, to think deductively from very few priori assumptions. Here, what is a priori? The priori is that it is not where did you study, but it is what you study and how you study is important. These are priori. By making these kinds of arguments, Rousseau revolutionized, all the institutions. Rousseau democratized all the institutions and man's social engagements and man's social world. So here, abstract priori is that, what you study is important than where you study. What you study is important than where you study. That is priori here for Rousseau. And so Rousseau's idea of a new man in the 18th century, in a sense, destroyed the very idea of foundations of institutions, culture, man's behavior, social behavior, man's custom that formed human civilizations through centuries. Your institutions, culture, habits, everything, which you have now is not a recent invention. It is evolved from the ancient world. From the time man began to live in communities, the language you have, the costume you have, the food culture you have, the faith system, the religion, your social world, your institutions, your political ideas, all these evolve through customs, habits, tradition. It is founded in history. And what Rousseau caused, Rousseau through French Revolution destroyed all the foundations of French society. Rousseau is culprit. This is what Burke argued against Rousseau. Interesting argument, friends. And another criticism was raised by Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine. If you come across the reading, you will get the name in McClleand's reading. Hippolyte Taine, I will only say Taine. Taine was a great historian of French Revolution. And Taine has written a famous book, The Origins of Contemporary France, which contains his critique of Rousseau. He was a second writer McClleand talks about in his approach to Rousseau. And The Origins of Contemporary France was written in 1875. And Burke wrote Reflections on the Revolutions of France. Reflections on the Revolutions of Revolutions in France, 1790 book. And Taine wrote in 1875 book, The Origins of Contemporary France. And Taine found contradictions in Rousseau. Rousseau is an arch rationalist. He found logic to things. But Taine argued there is another Rousseau. What is that Rousseau? Who is that Rousseau? A much more sinister Rousseau. A much more suspectful Rousseau. That Rousseau will give you the impression that something harmful, evil, or something harmful is happening. Was telling you that sinister Rousseau is skeptical about everything. That Rousseau is telling you that look around. There is something which will harm the society, which will bring evils to you. But on the other side, Rousseau was a logical man and he applied science to things and interpreted things very factually. But the other another Rousseau is sinister, and that sinister Rousseau is telling you that oh, look around, something is going to happen. So this is a contradiction in Rousseau. That's Taine argued. So according to Taine, of course, congratulatory accounts of revolution existed even before Taine started writings on the critic of French Revolution. He was also a critic of French Revolution. And there were congratulatory accounts of French Revolution. But Taine was not going to congratulate French Revolution, and Burke was not going to congratulate French Revolution. And Taine argued such congratulatory writings on French Revolution emphasized the heroism of the revolutionary wars, because congratulatory accounts of revolution placed revolution as heroic events. For example, the Franco-Prussian War, the Paris Commune, these are celebrated revolutionary events by the supporters of revolutions. And these supporters of revolution upheld the lynching by revolutionary mobs, the lynching by revolutionary mobs, the terror, the September massacres. These were glorified. The congratulatory accounts of French Revolution congratulated or supported or glorified the lynching by revolutionary mobs, the terror created by mobs, the September massacres. And this irrational mob, Taine was arguing that the mob which produced the French Revolution was irrational. And this mob, irrational mob, and the institutionalized terror, the terror was institutionalized through French Revolution. And where do we can find intellectual support to this irrational mob and institutionalized terror? Taine was arguing that, friends, you can find this intellectual support to irrational mob and institutionalized terror in French Revolution in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This is the lunatic side of Rousseau. This is the lunatic side of the character of Rousseau. He is mad. Rousseau was mad, paranoid dreamer of revenge upon his real and imagined enemies. And I have already told you in the previous reading that Rousseau always imagined about an illness which really did not exist, and he always also was frightened by certain enemies which never existed. So this was psychological side of Rousseau. That created a lot of problems for him. That's why he created a lot of enemies. Earlier they were his supporters and admirers and lovers. Later they became his enemies because of this lunatic side of Rousseau. And Taine argued that Rousseau was a very mad personality, a paranoid dreamer. Look at the vocabulary he uses. Rousseau was mad, paranoid dreamer of revenge upon his real and imagined enemies. Using so many, strong vocabularies against Rousseau. And Taine argued that enlightenment is dangerously infected by what he called the classical spirit. It was dangerously infected by what he called the classical spirit. What is classical spirit? Which Taine argued that it was very bad. Taine, like what Burke said, this classical spirit was inclined to reason, human reason. That is a priori from first principle. That something exists in the nature and we don't need proof for that. That is called priori. And classical tradition begins from that. And Rousseau begins from that. One aspect of Rousseau, according to Taine, was the search for a universal man, a rational man, an innocent man, a benevolent man. You can find in the writings of Rousseau his search for a universal man, a rational, innocent, and benevolent man. And 18th century political and social thought about man had a problem, according to Taine. It began to think away from men everything. It began to think away from men everything that they acquired as a result of living in a given moral, political, and social order. That all what you possess is because of a long tradition, a long history of moral, political, and social order. And friends, 18th century thoughts began to deviate from these kinds of existing thoughts, that what you possess, what your society hold, what your culture hold is not an invention in recent day, but that evolved from time to time. These kinds of thought prevailed in the world up to 17th century, and this was destroyed by contractualists as well as by enlightenment. And conservatives like Taine and Burke argued men had developed a social and political order out of custom, tradition, and history. That is what I told you about Oxford University in comparison to Kano University. For Taine, what was left was natural man as he was intended to be. That is, the political thought of enlightenment lacked the authority of a real social science. Enlightenment thought lacked the authority of a real social science. And the writers of enlightenment was lacking the spirit of real social science. They were all talking about some imaginary, priori assumptions. Real science seeks out facts, real facts. But Rousseau was not seeking real facts. Locke was not seeking real facts. Hobbes was not seeking real facts. They started from priori, natural rights, natural law. These are all priori. And Taine was critical of enlightenment for these priori assumptions. Taine thinks enlightenment misunderstood what science really was. That he criticized Hobbes. Hobbes was a contemporary of many great scientific revolutionaries we had studied in previous classes, and he had a mechanistic interpretation of human psychology, that humans respond to external events, and his social world is created by his behavior, that is his response to stimulus from the nature. That way created the social world. That is what Hobbes said. But Taine argued that thought system was based on a scientific worldview. That thought system of Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau was based on a scientific understanding of world. But that scientific understanding of the Enlightenment about science was wrong. Because The philosophers of enlightenment, including Rousseau, misunderstood geometry for science. They misunderstood geometry for science because in ancient world geometry was very more acceptable. When Rousseau talks about geometry, sorry, Plato talks about geometry, Aristotle talks about geometry, and in the education system of Rousseau in his Republic, geometry was an important knowledge system to be taught to philosopher king, to the guardian class. Citizens should learn geometry. And here in the Enlightenment spirit, the Enlightenment philosophers misunderstood geometry for science, but science is different according to Taine, and including also according to Burke. That is why Taine argued enlightenment has given way to a perverted Newtonianism. Taine was arguing that this enlightenment misunderstanding of science for geometry, friends, this caused a perversion of Newtonianism during Enlightenment era. That Newton was a contemporary of Thomas Hobbes. And we have understood that Locke has read Isaac Newton. Enlightenment science tried to understand human world from small number of fixed principles. And Newton's law of motion was based on certain fixed principles, very few fixed principles. And this Enlightenment science, which understood the human social world from a small number of fixed principles, that man got right, man got certain natural laws, and his society should be based on justice, and in the new society based on justice, the government should be founded, and government should grant right. These were the fixed principles according to which Enlightenment created a new world, a new man, citizen. Rousseau calls this new man citizen, and he himself declared, I am the citizen of Geneva. You remember last class I told you. And Taine argued, Enlightenment science did not use inductive inquiry from the real facts of social experience. When you said, when you criticize so many ideas, when in the Enlightenment spirit, you are criticizing based on certain, or limited number of facts. And your facts were not based on real social experience. Rather, your criticism started from priori. Rousseau used priori. Locke used priori. Hobbes also used priori, even though he was more, more empirical writer. The real facts of social experience, had made man the shameful creature he was. Taine was arguing that the real, so if you look at social life from real social facts, you can see man is leading a shameful life. But the Enlightenment science written off man to reveal the noble savage underneath. That Rousseau was talking about a noble savage. That man got, amor di soi, and his amor di soi was lost when he created a society. And in that new society he created, according to Rousseau, amor di soi has given way to amor propre, that is selfish love. Earlier, it was self-love, that I like ice cream. I told you that case. I like ice cream. But in the amor propre, in the new society, I began to judge what other people would think about me when I use a particular ice cream. Pride emerged. That's why, Enlightenment writers or Enlightenment science written of man to the level of a noble savage. Taine was arguing that the rationalist Rousseauist account of human nature did not find resemblance with actually what happened in French Revolution. That Rousseau had a great account of French Revolution, but Taine, when analyzed French Revolution, found that Rousseau's account of man cannot be found in the actual events of French Revolution. It was horrific. It was full of terror, institutionalized terror. That is what happened during French Revolution. But Rousseau glorified man's nature. And Rousseau's writing and what actually happened in the French Revolution did not find any analogy or any resemblance. So Rousseau was wrong, according to Taine. Now, friends, this is the Taine critic. And there is another critic by Alfred Coban, another critic by Talman, J.L. Talman. And I am running short of time, friends. I am not able to finish this critique of Rousseau by Alfred Coban and J.L. Talmon. So, shall I stop here and move on to next theme, next day, friends?
Sir.